Before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more bedtime stories. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is. And if there's a story you'd like to hear next, I'd love to know that too. There are winters that bite through bone. Winters so cruel that even breath seems to freeze before it leaves the lungs. But the winter of 1874 was different. It didn't just freeze flesh, it froze sorrow itself. That year, in a small, unnamed town resting beneath a crown of frost and silence, something happened that would haunt both science and faith for generations to come. It began inside a weathered cottage at the edge of town, where the wind hummed through broken shutters and the hearth glowed faintly, unable to fight the cold. Inside that house lay Margaret Hale, a 59-year-old widow who had spent her final years in solitude, haunted by the memory of her husband, a miner lost to the earth in a collapse decades before. They never recovered his body. Locals said that from that day forward, Margaret's heart never truly thawed. She spoke to no one. Her daughters said they sometimes found her staring out the window at the snow, whispering his name to the wind. Then came January, a month so bitter that the very breath of the living left frost on their lips. Pneumonia struck Margaret hard. For days she struggled to breathe, coughing blood into linen rags that froze stiff overnight. Her daughters did what they could, boiling water, placing hot stones by her feet, praying through the night. But when dawn came, her breath faltered, rattled in her chest, and stopped. Her daughters wept. But before their tears even fell, they noticed something impossible. Beneath their mother's closed eyes, tiny clear shards began to form. At first they thought it was moisture, ordinary tears crystallized by the cold. But these were not droplets. They were perfect slivers of ice emerging from beneath the lids as though her eyes themselves were freezing from within. The girls screamed for help, summoning Dr. Archer, the town's only physician. He arrived breathless, lantern in hand, his boots coated in frost. When he touched the crystals with his gloved fingers, he recoiled. They were solid, colder than anything natural, as though carved from a deep well of ice. By the time Margaret's body reached the county morgue that night, whispers had already begun. The people called her the Widow of Frozen Tears. The morgue was a place of stone walls and iron tables, dimly lit by oil lamps that hissed in the draft. The smell of decay hung in the air, faintly masked by carbolic acid. Men in thick coats worked quietly, their breath misting as they lifted the dead from wooden carts. When they unwrapped Margaret's shroud, her face was serene, lips pale, lashes frozen, and yet, there they were again. The faint outlines of crystalline tears, still glinting under the light. The attendants murmured prayers. The cold of the room was normal. They had blocks of river ice packed around bodies every winter, but these tears were something else. Even when brought in from her warmer home, they hadn't melted, and within an hour of resting her on the slab, new ones formed. It was as if something beneath her skin continued to weep, grief crystallizing at the edge of death. That night, the attendants claimed to hear faint cracking sounds, like thin ice forming over water. No one dared look closely after dark. The next morning, Dr. Archer returned with 2 colleagues from a nearby town, both learned men who dismissed superstition. They approached the slab with notebooks and magnifying lenses. Their lamps cast harsh circles of light upon the corpse. For hours they studied the tears. One doctor claimed it must be crystallized salts expelled from the tear ducts. Another argued no salt could form such perfect symmetry. "These are not salts," he said, quietly. "They are something else." Still, none could explain why new crystals continued to emerge, or why they refused to melt even under lamplight. When one physician scraped a sample into a vial, he found it melted instantly. But moments later, tiny frost lines began to spread, along the glass refreezing before his eyes. The men stared in silence. Dr. Archer finally whispered, "It is as though sorrow itself has found form." By the 3rd night, Margaret's body was prepared for burial. The attendants worked in silence, the faint echo of wind howling through the corridor. One reached to close her eyelids and gasped. Before his very eyes, crystals began to form, again pressing outward slowly, silently, as if the body itself resisted final rest. One broke cleanly under his touch, scattering across the floor like shards of glass. That was enough. The men refused to stay longer. They wrapped her quickly, murmured prayers under their breath, and extinguished their lamps one by one. The next morning, under a sky the color of pewter, Margaret Hale was laid to rest in the frozen churchyard. The ground was so hard the gravediggers had to pour boiling water to soften it. The frost clung to their beards as they worked, steam mingling with their breath. Her 2 daughters stood in black veils, their hands trembling. They did not cry, perhaps out of fear that their tears too might freeze. As the coffin descended, a gust of wind swept through the graveyard. One of the daughters later swore she heard a faint crackling sound beneath the earth, like ice splintering on a pond. That night, frost formed on the church windows in strange patterns, thin branching lines that resembled human tears. Within weeks, everyone in town had heard of the frozen widow. Some believed it a sign from God, that her grief for her lost husband had frozen in death, eternal and pure. Others whispered it was the devil's work, that she had been visited by her husband's spirit, who came in frost to claim her soul. The story reached even the neighboring towns. People came to the churchyard, touching her grave to feel if the soil was colder than the rest, and many swore it was. Even in spring, the earth above her grave never thawed fully. Children whispered that if you placed your ear to the ground, you could hear faint tinkling sounds beneath, the sound of tears freezing and breaking over and over. Decades later, historians and scientists attempted to explain it. Some said it was a natural reaction, gases, crystallization, or a trick of temperature. Others suggested psychosomatic lore, a tale grown in the telling. But no one could explain the witness accounts, the tears that formed anew after the body had been drained and embalmed, or the way frost patterns mirrored eyes and tears upon her coffin lid. To this day, no scientific record disproves what happened. Only the coroner's ledger remains written in neat Victorian hand. Subject: Margaret Hale, 59. Crystals formed beneath eyes, persistent. Nature unknown. More than a century later, visitors to the old cemetery still speak of her. They say, the patch of grass above her grave is always damp and cold even in the sun. Some have claimed to see glints of light, as though something beneath the soil catches the morning dew and turns it to frost. They call it the widow's frost, but among the locals, the story has another name, the frozen tears, because sorrow, that deep, does not vanish. It waits, crystallized in silence, beneath the earth, where grief turns to glass and refuses to melt. And every winter, when the cold returns and the ground grows hard again, people say you can still feel her there, the widow who wept ice, her tears frozen forever between this world and the next. There are few things that can make even a coroner lose his appetite. The smell of decay, the sight of blood, the stiffness of death, these become routine after years of service. But every once in a while, something arrives at the morgue that defies everything you've learned about life and everything you thought you understood about death. In the spring of 1875, in a damp riverside town in Lancashire, England, one such body was delivered. The man's name was Samuel Carter, and his death, as the newspapers would later whisper, was not the strange part of his story. It was what refused to die with him. The body came on a wagon under the first thunderstorm of the season. 2 men hauled the corpse into the old county morgue, soaked to the bone. Found him by the riverbank, one said, wiping his nose. Must have drowned. At first glance, the coroner agreed. Carter's skin was pale and swollen, lips blue, eyes half open. But something about the body unsettled him. A faint blackness under the fingernails, as though he'd clawed at something before death. They placed him on the slab, covered him with linen, and left for the night. But in the morning, when the attendants entered, they froze. The body was untouched, but the rats were dead. In those days, the morgue's basement was crawling with rats. Dozens of them. No matter how much poison or traps were set, they always returned. They fed on the refuse of death, tissue, scraps, the runoff of the embalming fluids. But that morning, they found 5 of them, stiff, twisted, mouths foaming, lying near Carter's slab. The others stayed hidden in the shadows, squealing, but never venturing close. One of the attendants, a man named Brigg, lifted a dead rat with his gloved hand and muttered, "Never seen him refuse a body before." The coroner laughed nervously. "Rats are smarter than we think," he said. But when he lifted the sheet from Samuel Carter's face, his smile faded. There was no sign of decomposition, not a single fly. And worse, the eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. The pupils had turned the color of wet ash. The body looked as though it were watching. By the second day, Carter's body should have begun to change. The morgue was damp and warm. Bodies decayed within hours in such conditions. But not this one. His skin stayed intact. His veins, faintly visible beneath the surface, appeared darker by the hour, as if something still moved within them. When the coroner made the first incision, the smell was wrong. It wasn't decay. It was iron, sharp, metallic, like fresh blood. He swore under his breath. The blood that leaked out wasn't dark and clotted like a dead man's. It was red. Too red. Brigg turned pale. "That ain't right, sir. He's been dead 2 days." The coroner wiped his knife and muttered, "Then explain this." From the corner of the slab, a rat appeared, small, gray, trembling. It crept closer to the corpse, sniffed the air, and then, in one violent twitch, collapsed, dead before it even touched the skin. The room went silent. Samuel Carter had been a coal laborer at the Wren Hollow mine. He was known as a quiet man, a widower who worked hard and spoke little. But there were rumors, whispers that he'd made some kind of bargain after his wife's death, that he'd gone to a black chapel outside of town, where miners left coins for luck before entering the earth. According to his co-workers, Carter had begun wearing a charm around his neck, a small hand-carved talisman made of bone. And ever since then, nothing seemed to harm him. When a mine shaft collapsed that killed 6 men, he walked out without a scratch. When the roof caved, in another day he was buried for hours, yet they dug him out breathing. "He said the dead don't want me," one miner recalled. "Said they already tried." By the 4th night, the morgue attendants refused to go near Carter's body. The air around the slab had grown cold, heavy, like the chill of an open grave. The oil lamps flickered whenever someone stepped near him, and still, the rats stayed away. Finally, the coroner decided to end the madness. He ordered the body sealed in a coffin and buried immediately. But when they lifted Carter from the slab, a sound escaped his throat. Not a moan, not a breath. Something like a low hiss of air escaping, a sealed chamber. Brigg dropped his end of the coffin. "God help us," he whispered. "He's breathing." The coroner shook his head. "It's gas, a natural reaction," he insisted. But when they tried again, the same sound came, longer, softer, and this time, the eyes flickered. For just a moment, the pupils dilated. The attendants fled the room. They buried him that same night in St. Bartholomew's churchyard. No priest, no prayer, just the sound of shovels striking wet earth. The coroner signed the death ledger with shaking hands. But by morning, something had dug into the grave. The earth was disturbed, claw marks visible in the mud, not from above but from beneath. The gravedigger swore he heard movement under the ground before dawn, a scratching, a thumping. But when he returned, at sunrise everything was silent again. Only the rats were missing. A week later, the town's butcher found a dead rat on his doorstep, bloated, its mouth blackened. Then another, then dozens. All along the alleys near the river, the rats were dying, their bodies scattered like refuse. Yet none showed any wounds. It was as though they'd simply stopped living. Then one night, a drunk miner stumbled into the tavern pale as snow. He swore he saw Samuel Carter standing in the graveyard, mud up to his knees, head tilted, eyes like smoke. The next day, that same miner was found dead in his bed, his skin ashen, his veins dark as ink. Years passed, but no one in the town ever dug up his grave again. The churchyard was abandoned, the ground fenced off, and the morgue records sealed. But old gravediggers tell a story still whispered by candlelight, that every spring, when the earth softens and the river swells, rats flee from the churchyard. No one knows why, and those who go near it after dark sometimes hear scratching from beneath the soil, like fingernails dragging on wood. The legend says Samuel Carter was not cursed. He was protected, that something in that black chapel beneath the earth marked him as its own, and whatever that was, it refused to let him rot. Even death, it seems, didn't want him, because in that town people say there are two kinds of graves, those that rest in peace and those that feed nothing. And Samuel Carter's grave, it feeds nothing, not even the rats. They say shadows only follow the living, but in 1997 I watched one kneel beside the dead and pray. I'd been a funeral director for nearly 15 years by then, long enough to believe I'd seen everything that could happen to a human body. I was wrong. The call came one cold February morning. The county needed a body exhumed for a legal inquiry. The man's name was Edward Marsh, buried 8 years prior in the quiet town of Rockford, Illinois. His widow claimed he'd been murdered, not by accident as the coroner reported, so they wanted him dug up, examined again, for the truth. It was routine work, at least on paper. But the minute I saw the grave, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hesitation. The air was heavier there, the ground darker than the rest, as if the soil itself had been absorbing something it shouldn't have. The dig team arrived at dawn, breath steaming, shovels biting into the earth. The sound of metal on stone echoed in the still air. It took them nearly 3 hours to reach the coffin. When we pried open the lid, the smell hit us first. That sweet, chemical rot that clings to your clothes for days. But what made us step back wasn't the smell. It was the shadow. Inside the coffin, Edward Marsh's body lay as expected, half preserved by the clay and cold. But under the flicker of the floodlights, I noticed something impossible. There was a shadow in the coffin, one that didn't belong. It wasn't cast by any of us. We checked our lights, our positions, but it was still there. A darker shape crouched beside the corpse, kneeling, as though it were praying. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks. The mind does strange things when surrounded by death, but the others saw it too. "Jesus Christ," one of the workers whispered, and as he said it, the shadow moved. Just a flicker, a tilt of the head like it had turned to look at us. The floodlight sputtered, then went out. For a moment we were swallowed in darkness, and in that dark I heard something. A faint rustle, the sound of dry earth shifting. When the light came back on, the shadow was gone. But the coffin looked different. Edward's hands, which had been crossed over his chest, were now folded together, fingers interlocked, like in prayer. We transported the body to the prep room that night. Old habits kept me calm. Gloves on, tools laid out, record notes. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every corner of the room felt too dark. Every hum of the fluorescent lights too soft. The exhumed dead are always unsettling. They're bodies that should have finished their decay, yet somehow haven't. But this one was different. His eyes were sunken deep, but the skin around them had dark stains as though something had seeped from within. His fingernails were black, but not from dirt. The color spread beneath the nail beds, almost like bruises, symmetrical, deliberate. When I went to clean the body, I noticed it again. Beneath the table, my shadow bent with me, as it should. But there was another, a faint, kneeling shape, on the tile beside the table. It wasn't mine. It was smaller, thinner, its shoulders hunched, its head bowed, hands pressed together, like before. Like in the grave. That night I stayed late to finish the paperwork. Everyone else had gone home. The morgue was silent except for the hum of the cooling system. Then I heard it, a faint sound, Not from the hall, not from the vents. It was coming from the table. A soft whisper, barely audible. It wasn't speech, not at first. More like a breath moving through a hollow throat. Then, slowly, it formed words. Let him rest. The voice was thin, desperate, like it had come from deep. Under the earth, I dropped my pen. It clattered against the floor, echoing too loudly in the empty room. When I looked back at the body, the shadow was kneeling again. But this time its hands were not folded in prayer. They were reaching toward the corpse's face. The next day, the forensic team came to examine the remains. I didn't mention what I'd seen. They would have laughed, or worse, thought I'd lost my mind. They worked quickly, recording everything. Cause of death still listed as asphyxiation due to soil compression. Nothing unusual, nothing supernatural. But as they packed up, one of them, a young technician, frowned and said, "Did anyone notice his eyes are open now?" Everyone froze. I stepped closer. He was right. The eyelids had lifted halfway, revealing the glassy, blackened pupils. And in that reflection, I swear I saw something that wasn't us. A dark shape hovering behind me, bent low, head tilted. When I turned, there was nothing. The body was finally scheduled for reburial. But that night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the kneeling figure in the corner of my room. Silent, patient, as if waiting for me to turn off the light. At 10:47 a.m., I heard something from my hallway, a slow, dragging sound. I opened my door and there it was, a dark shape on the floor crawling toward the front door. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. Then it stopped, and slowly, it rose. Not into the air, but into the shape of a man kneeling. Same posture, same bowed head. I whispered, "What do you want?" It didn't answer. It only raised one arm, bony, trembling, and pointed toward the window. Outside, in the glow of the streetlight, I saw two figures by the hearse parked across the street, the reburial team. They were lowering the coffin into the ground, and as the coffin touched the soil, the shadow beside me faded, just dissolved, gone. The next morning, I went to the cemetery. The grave was fresh, soil damp and dark. But on the mound of dirt there were two impressions. One was the mark of a coffin's weight. The other, faint, shallow, unmistakable, was the outline of knees. It looked as if something had knelt there all night, praying, waiting, guarding. Some nights, when I close up the prep room and turn off the lights, I still look for my shadow, to make sure it's the only one that follows me. Because what I learned that winter in Illinois is this: the dead may rest, but sometimes something else stays behind to make sure they do. And if you ever exhume the past, make sure it's ready to be disturbed. Because when I opened that coffin, I didn't just wake the dead, I woke the thing that prays for them. Some objects don't just reflect the dead, they remember them. In the winter of 1901, the last of the Ashcroft family died inside their crumbling estate on the outskirts of Maine. The mansion was a decaying labyrinth of oak corridors and cold, parlors filled with relics, portraits that seemed to breathe dust, clocks that hadn't ticked in decades, and mirrors. Dozens of them. When I arrived, I wasn't there for the living, I was there to collect the body. My name is Thomas Reed, and I was the county's undertaker, a man who made his living from the silence after life. I'd been to the Ashcroft estate before, once, when the matriarch passed. She'd requested that the mirrors be covered during her wake. Never let the dead see themselves, she'd whispered on her deathbed. At the time, I thought it was superstition. Now I know better. When I entered the parlor, Eleanor Ashcroft lay in her velvet chair, as though she'd fallen asleep mid-conversation. The fire had gone out hours before. Frost crept up the windows. Beside her was a mirror, an ornate oval piece framed in tarnished silver, so tall it nearly reached the ceiling. The caretaker told me it had belonged to her grandfather, imported from France, crafted by a man who went mad before finishing it. She spoke to it every night, the caretaker said, swore it whispered back. I nodded, pretending not to care. But as I bent over the body, something caught my eye. The surface of the mirror wasn't still. It rippled faintly, as though something beneath the glass was breathing. I told myself it was the firelight. But when I turned, the hearth was cold, yet there it was, a movement inside the mirror, soft and deliberate. It wasn't my reflection. It wasn't hers. It was behind us both, faint, blurred, like a figure standing in fog. I called the caretaker, but he'd gone to fetch blankets, so it was just me, the corpse, and the mirror. When I looked again, the figure was closer, its outline clear now, shoulders hunched, face hidden. It stood directly behind Eleanor's chair, where I was standing moments ago. I turned instantly, heart pounding. Nothing. Only the empty parlor, the ticking of a clock that shouldn't have been ticking. When I faced the mirror again, the figure was gone. But there was something else now, a faint handprint on the inside of the glass. By evening I had the body in my carriage, but as I left the mansion, the caretaker called out from the doorway, "You forgot to cover the mirror." I froze. Tradition said mirrors must be veiled after death to stop the soul from getting trapped. I'd done it hundreds of times. But that night, for reasons I still can't explain, I didn't go back. That was my first mistake. The Ashcroft woman was taken to the county morgue that night. The room was quiet, lit only by a single bulb that buzzed weakly. I set to work, cleaning, dressing, stitching, the usual rituals of preservation. But every few minutes I felt it, a faint vibration on the metal table, as if someone were tapping beneath it. When I checked, there was nothing there. The sound would stop the moment I looked down, and start again when I turned away. By 2 a.m., I was almost finished. That's when I heard it. A whisper, soft, breathless, right behind my ear. It was a woman's. Soyuz, gentle, familiar. It said one word, "Look." I turned slowly toward the prep room mirror, the one we used to check clothing and presentation. There, reflected perfectly, was Eleanor's body, and standing behind her, with hands pressed to her shoulders, was another Eleanor. Translucent, pale, her mouth near her own ear, whispering to herself. Then she turned toward me, and smiled. The light above me flickered violently. The reflection stuttered, like film skipping. Then, crack. A hairline fracture spread across the mirror from top to bottom. I jumped back, heart racing. The sound of shattering glass echoed, though the mirror hadn't fallen. In the reflection, both Eleanors were gone, but the handprint remained. That same handprint I'd seen in her parlor, only now it was on my side of the glass. The next morning, the coroner came to sign off the papers. He stopped halfway through his inspection and said quietly, "Did you notice her eyes?" I leaned in. Eleanor's eyes, which I'd closed hours ago, were open again. Worse, the pupils had mirrored streaks in them, like thin silver cracks running through black glass, exactly like the one on the mirror. I sealed her coffin within. The hour. The funeral was private, attended by no one but the caretaker. I lowered her into the ground myself, reciting the words from memory. The caretaker placed a bouquet of white lilies, then stepped back and whispered, "She's still there. You know." I thought he meant heaven, but he pointed behind me. When I turned, I saw the carriage window, and in its reflection, just for a moment, Eleanor standing by the grave. Her face was calm, her hands clasped, and beside her, another figure, watching me. It was not human. Its limbs too long, its reflection bending where glass shouldn't bend. 2 weeks later, I woke to a sound that froze my blood. It was the faint tap, tap, tap of fingernails on glass, coming from my parlor. When I entered, every mirror in my house and every framed surface, even the window, was fogged from within. And on one of them, Written backwards was a single word. Look. I covered them all that night. But even covered, I could hear it. Faint whispers behind the sheets like someone speaking just on the other side of the glass. I moved out of that house a month later. But sometimes when I pass an antique shop, I catch my reflection in a tall mirror. And for just a second, I see her there beside me, whispering, "I told you not to leave it uncovered." The Ashcroft estate was demolished in 1903. Workers reported strange accidents, shattered windows, tools breaking, and one man claiming he saw his own reflection blink when he didn't. The mirror itself was never found. But local collectors say a silver-framed oval mirror sometimes appears at estate sales across New England, always in perfect condition no matter its age. Those who buy it report the same thing. At first, just a faint distortion, a ripple in the reflection, then whispers in the dark, and finally, the sound of fingertips tapping on the inside of the glass. Because some mirrors don't just show what's there, they hold on to what shouldn't be, and once you've looked into them, they never stop looking back. Some say evil doesn't die, it just changes form and waits to be found again. In 1947, in a small town on the edge of Connecticut, a man named Victor Hensley lived alone in a decaying workshop. He was a doll maker, once famous for his handcrafted porcelain faces, their eyes so lifelike they unsettled the people who bought them. After his wife's death, his work changed. The dolls grew pale, almost translucent, with glass eyes that seemed aware. Local children whispered that he used real hair and teeth in his dolls. Adults dismissed it as gossip. But when Hensley stopped leaving his house altogether, people began to talk again, especially after the mailman noticed something strange, dolls appearing in windows at night, their heads turning as he passed. Months later, after Victor's sudden disappearance, police entered the workshop. What they found was more disturbing than any story. Hundreds of dolls lined the shelves, all facing the center of the room, as if waiting for someone to speak. On the table lay an unfinished doll, small, pale, and eerily human-like. But the thing that caught their attention most was the journal. Its first few pages were about the process: molding clay, firing porcelain, painting delicate cheeks. But as the entries went on, the handwriting changed, from neat cursive to desperate scratches. Here's what they read. February 18th. She told me she can hear them, the ones behind the walls. She says they whisper names. March 2. The glass eyes won't stay quiet. They move when I'm not looking. March 29th. She wants a new body. Says this one's cracking. I can hear her crying when the fire goes out. April 5th. She says her name isn't Annabelle. Not anymore. On the back of the final page was something strange. A drawing of a mirror, a tall silver-framed one, with a shadowed figure standing behind it. Beneath it, a line written in trembling script. The mirror showed me how to make her real. The detectives didn't understand it at the time, but decades later, paranormal researchers linked Hensley's workshop to a certain mirror recovered from the Ashcroft estate, the same mirror from the Whispering Glass, 1901. According to property records, it had been purchased at an estate sale by a private collector in 1938. That collector was Victor Hensley. The mirror hadn't just survived, it had found its next host. The unfinished doll from Hensley's workshop was taken as evidence and locked, away in the basement of the county police department. Officers joked about it. One even moved it from room to room to scare the night guards, until the first one died. His body was found inside the evidence room, slumped against the shelf. His eyes were wide open, pupils clouded with a faint milky sheen like porcelain glaze. Beside him, the doll lay broken, and from the shards of its head, something small and black had spilled, like soot or ash. The medical examiner listed it as a heart attack, but the second officer who entered the room 2 nights later said he heard whispering. Not random murmurs, but his own name, repeated over and over, He quit the next day. Years passed. The doll was eventually forgotten, sealed in a wooden crate, then misplaced during a basement flood in the 1970s. When the department moved locations, that crate was auctioned off with dozens of others. No one kept records of who bought it. But in 1981, a family in Rhode Island reported finding an old porcelain doll inside a sealed box purchased from a police surplus sale. They placed it in their daughter's room. Within weeks, the girl began speaking to it when calling it by a name no one had taught her. "Anna," she said. "Anna says she doesn't like mirrors." When the family priest came to bless the home, he refused to touch the doll. He said he could hear a woman's voice echoing faintly inside the porcelain, a voice calling for Victor. The doll was eventually confiscated by a pair of paranormal investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren, and placed in a glass case labeled simply, "Warning, positively do not open." In 1992, a recorded interview surfaced among collectors, allegedly of Lorraine Warren herself. In it, she described a transference case, where a cursed object had carried energy across generations. Her words, "It started with a mirror. The mirror became a vessel, and the vessel became a child's toy. Once the spirit learns how to bind, it never lets go. They say Annabelle was just a doll. She was never just a doll." In 2017, after a museum power outage, security footage captured something disturbing. The case holding Annabelle flickered in the dark, and for 3 seconds, her head turned. Investigators dismissed it as a trick of the light. But if you slow down the footage, you'll see something else, a faint reflection on the glass case. It wasn't the security guard. It was a woman in a long black dress, standing just behind the doll, one hand pressed against the glass. Her face was pale, eyes wide, lips moving silently. And if you amplify the audio, you can hear it, a whisper beneath the static. Victor. They say the mirror and the doll were two halves of the same curse, a spirit searching for form, for flesh, for continuation. The mirror holds the reflection. The doll holds the body. And as long as someone looks, as long as someone believes, the story will never end. So the next time you see Annabelle's glass case in a video or a museum, look closely at your own reflection behind her. If it moves, even a little, don't blink, because she's not trapped inside. You are.